propane forge is an extremely useful tool in the blacksmith shop. And while I'm not going to discuss forge design or building in this video, I'm going to discuss propane and some of the issues surrounding having propane in your shop. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off so that we can hear better. This is actually a video response to a video done by Roy over at Christ-Centered Ironworks. He offers some great advice for new blacksmiths and blacksmithing businesses, people that are just getting started. Good channel to go watch. But he did a video the other day, yesterday I believe, on propane in the shop. I'll try and put a link right up here so you can go watch that video if you choose to. And there was some discussion on that about the safety of having a propane cylinder in the shop, which is quite common for people running a propane forge. The propane's got to come from someplace. The 100-pound propane cylinder is the classic solution to this. Most blacksmiths running a propane forge run a 100-pound cylinder. You can use the little 20-pound barbecue-sized bottles, but they can't keep up. Propane is a liquid, and it's compressed into the cylinder, and it has to vaporize and go from liquid to vapor or gas to be usable. And the 20-pound bottles simply can't vaporize fast enough because they are so small that they can't keep up with most forges. So they're not a very good solution. You can use them for a little while, but when they're about half empty, they start to ice up and they just don't work very well anymore. So the 100-pound bottle is the way most people go. And it is quite common for this 100-pound propane cylinder to be about this close to the forge. You're limited by the hoses on your forge. And yes, you can add longer hoses. That's not a problem. But the reality is most people don't. Most people, it's within 3 or 4 feet of the forge. So the question is that a big problem? My opinion, it's not really a big problem. I would rather not have a propane cylinder in the shop, and we'll get around to discussing that in just a minute. But the risk really isn't the cylinder. What you worry about is with the cylinder, and what people were commenting on was the risk of a catastrophic event involving this cylinder. That's known as a BLEVE, a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, and they are horrendous. I've never seen one personally. I've seen lots of training videos as a firefighter concerning BLEVEs, but in 27 years as a firefighter, I responded to quite a number of fires where propane tanks were in the vicinity or actively involved in the fire, and none of them ever BLEVEd. The safety features on the tank work. And I've never seen one fail. It's certainly a possibility. But the reality is if you have a fire in your shop that will cause this tank to get hot enough for the liquid to boil and expand at a rate that overpowers the safety valve on this tank, your shop is burning to the ground anyways. You're long gone. It's lost. You're not going to save it. So the BLEVE, while you're working in the shop, just isn't really much of an issue in my opinion. Now don't let me dictate your safety. You do what you think is safe. And really I don't keep these in the shop. This isn't how I work. You'll notice there's nothing connected to this. This is just an example for today's video. The real risk in the shop is leaky fittings, lack of proper maintenance, and burning through these rubber hoses. But almost every forge has rubber hoses. You can get really expensive braided metal hoses, but still underneath they're rubber, and you can still burn through them if you're not careful. So it's attention to safety and taking care of your own safety and taking responsibility is what really matters. If you want this tank further from the forge, you don't want it within the hose reach, and you put longer hoses, that's great. That's going to help. It's going to reduce any risk from a leak from the tank, but it doesn't do anything for a leak somewhere else in the hose or a leak up here in the valves. It's all still potentially a problem regardless of where this tank is. And if you make the hoses longer so you can move the tank, you have now created more rubber hose issues, more places for them to snag, snarl, have stuff dropped on them, have hot iron dropped and burn through them, trip over them. If you trip over the hoses, you're liable to pull the tank over, you're liable to pull the forge over. It's going to be a much bigger problem. So keeping this within a safe distance, if you can put your hand on the tank and leave it there, it's not getting too hot. The problem is always going to be leaky valves, leaky hoses, leaky fittings, lack of attention to those details. That's where people get in trouble. When people burn their shop down because of propane issues, it's the same as when they burn their shop down because of their oxyacetylene torch or oxypropane torch or anything else. It's usually because they failed to shut it off properly when they went in for the night. If you shut it off at the valve and you make sure it's off, the odds of a problem are very slim, not much of an issue. But having said that, I don't like having the tank in my shop. There is always a chance of a leak, and you're better off if you don't have this tank in your shop. So I prefer not to. For years I kept these outside the shop, and I ran a line in through the wall that protected the rubber hose, and it ran along a wall at the base of the floor where it was out of the way and ran to the forge. As I expanded, my forge is now more in the middle of the shop, and to do that the hose would be in a walking path. So that's not as good a solution with my current setup. So what did I do to solve that problem? No longer use the 100-pound tanks is the big thing. I went to an outdoor tank. So let's take a look at what that is. This is a 500-gallon propane tank. The 100-pound tank, and they're measured differently, is about 25 gallons of propane. So this is a lot more propane. It's a much bigger bomb if something bad were to happen. We live in a wildfire area, and these tanks do become involved in fire when we have forest fires. Luckily we don't have them very often, but it is a possibility. But never have we had one of these tanks go off in the area. I don't know of any reports, because these pop-off valves do the job they're meant to do. This is a big tank. It sits out away from the building, and I've got about 50 feet of underground piping. That was the hardest part of doing this. The tank itself is provided by the propane company. They own the tank. I lease it. I pay $50 a year to lease the tank. Whether I use it or not, that's all I have to pay. The hard part was trenching all the way along here to the shop. And I'll give you an idea of how far that is. So there's that tank. We go past some construction projects here. Now this tank in the foreground is not being used. I'm eventually going to cut it into something else, and there's the shop. And that's where we have to bring the propane line in. This is where the propane line comes in from the ground, comes up, and comes in here at one pressure, and then goes through this regulator to reduce the pressure further to domestic household pressure. Like I said, running the gas line was the biggest issue. It's about 50 feet of line. I had to rent a trencher. There's lots of roots from trees that have been cut down, still have roots and little stumps left over. And it was a whole lot of work, but that was the worst part of it. At that point, I hired a plumber who was qualified to do the job and run the gas line, so I didn't have to do it myself. And he brought all the proper tools, the proper type of gas line, and put the gas line in the ground and did all the work in the shop. Now my gas line comes in hard pipe. It's a flex line underground. But once it comes into the building, it's all in black pipe. And it comes in, this is the domestic side, the low pressure side. And is it currently used? If I ever put a furnace in here or some kind of heat or need a reason for low pressure gas, I have that available. It's got a valve on it, it's plugged, it's not a problem. I have an extra fitting here. I can actually hook up my torch regulator and use oxypropane instead of oxyacetylene. But that takes some special tips. The gas companies recommend a special regulator, special hoses, and I haven't invested in that stuff yet, so I'm not currently using this. But I could hook up a second forge to it. All of this has a regulator at the tank set at 25 psi, so I can regulate it down from there in the shop. I don't have to run out to the tank to adjust my regulator. If I only need 5 psi to run a torch tip, I can use a torch regulator to set that pressure. This thing goes up and overhead where it's out of the way and out of trouble. To this fitting. And this is where I can turn this off at night and make sure that my gas is off. So if there's any leaks in the regulator, the gauge, the hose fittings, the valves on the forge, this ceases to be an issue. And that makes it a lot safer, a lot more convenient. And really, when it comes right down to it, it's that convenience that was one of the main reasons I put the yard tank in. I had 400-pound cylinders outside the shop where they were not leaking the cylinder valve, or the regulator at the cylinder wasn't going to fill up the shop with propane. So it was a lot safer in that regard, but I still had to load 2, 3, or 4, if I didn't plan well, propane cylinders in the back of the pickup, which took about a half an hour, drive 45 minutes to town, to where the propane company is, take a half an hour to fill them, drive 45 minutes back, and then another half hour to unload them and get one of them hooked back up again. And then as one went empty, I would switch the regulator over the others. So that's at least 3 hours involved in switching propane tanks. In the winter, when there was snow on the ground, it was harder to get to that side of the shop. It took longer. So it was really sort of a nuisance. That's essentially a half a day of work lost. Probably not once a month, maybe every other month if I'm not working real hard every third month. But that's 2, 3, 4 days lost a year, depending on how often you have to go in and fill propane bottles. And time is money when you're running a small business. So I really didn't want to keep doing that. It's also just a nuisance, and I don't like lifting those heavy cylinders. They're hard on your back. The older I get, the less I want to lift heavy stuff. So I just didn't want to keep doing it. I don't remember the exact cost of running the propane line. There was the expense of running the trencher and hiring the plumber. If your tank is closer, and it can certainly be closer, code will allow it to be closer than where I put mine. My location is largely chosen because it's right next to a little spur road that comes up to the shop, and the propane truck driver can still get in there and fill the tank in the winter, whereas if it was right up as close to the shop as code would allow, which I think is 10 to 20 feet, something like that, it would be a lot harder for him to get up there and fill it, because that road I don't maintain very well. So if you got a flat site, it's easy for the propane driver to get to. I'm guessing that installing a tank probably isn't going to cost more than $300 or $400. Don't quote me on that. Do your research first. Talk to a plumber. Well, certainly a lot of this plumbing could be done by an individual. It's way better done by a licensed plumber that knows what they're doing. So that's just sort of my story on how I keep propane and why I went to a 500-pound tank outside. Now, it is expensive. It can cost me $600 to fill that thing if I let it get too empty. I try to get it filled when it gets down to about 40%, so I don't have to worry about it. But that tank will go 3 or 4 months of full-time, heavy forging. That's production work, not hobby work. If you're doing hobby work, that tank might last you a year. So it's really a pretty convenient way to go if you can do it. Now, if you're in a an urban area, in a subdivision somewhere, they probably would frown on that if you have natural gas service. It's just not something people are used to. But we're in a rural area, and propane is what the house runs on. So the propane truck comes up here to fill the house tank anyways, so we might as well use it. Now, as much as I would like to not have propane cylinders in the shop, both because they're in the way and a nuisance, and there's always that potential for a leak, when it gets cold in here and I'm not standing next to the forge, if I'm doing bench work or out grinding in the grinding area, I do bring in a small tank with a tank top heater to add a little extra heat to the shop. It really makes things bearable. So that's my opinion on propane. I hope that did some good. Roy, I hope that answered some of your questions and will inspire you to get a 500-pound tank in the yard, if for no other reason, because it's going to make your life easier. I don't know if it's really increases the safety factor that much, but it probably does to some extent. It'll also give you a little bit more square footage in the shop for some other tool where the propane tank sits right now. So everybody else, thanks for bearing with me. We'll get back to some actual forge work in the next video. Have a good day.